The mud came first, a sucking, greedy slurry, the color of wet concrete that pulled the tank dozer down to its belly within minutes of touching the western bank. The blade bit into the deep silt, and the tracks churned useless foam as the steel beast lurched and died. German 88mm shells began walking their way up the streambed, throwing geysers of brown water and mud into the air. The crossing ramp was never carved. The infantry waiting in Scherpenzeel could hear the shriek of the incoming rounds over the rattle of small arms fire, and they watched the cloud of brown smoke rise from their dead armor, the first proof on the morning of October 2nd that nothing would go according to plan. But how does an infantry division crack open a line of steel and concrete fortifications that German engineers spent years perfecting when the armored spearhead meant to carry them through is already sinking into the riverbed? To understand the answer, you have to go back to the hours just before dawn, when the men of the 30th Infantry Division crouched in the cellars and hedgerows of Scherpenzeel and listened to the final rolling thunder of their own artillery preparation, their backs loaded with flamethrowers, pole charges, and satchel bags of TNT. Lieutenant Colonel William D. Duncan's 743rd Tank Battalion reached the Worm River at first light with a specific critical tool, a tank dozer leading a sled stacked with steel culverts, the engineers' answer to a soft-bottomed stream that had to support 40 tons of Sherman armor. Enemy artillery observers, posted in the tall slag heaps east of Pallenberg, spotted the dust plume of the column the moment it cleared the town's rubble. An accurate barrage, German 105mm and 150mm salvos mixed with mortar fire, pinned everyone flat in the muck for 35 minutes. When the fire lifted just enough for the dozer crew to lurch forward, the machine barely managed to push one culvert into the water before its tracks chewed through the thin crust of solid ground and into the deep grey clay beneath. Then, 2 medium tanks rolled forward to winch the dozer free, and their suspension bogged down to the spunsons, trapping them in the mud with the engine decks awash. Under a renewed hail of mortar and machine gun fire, the engineers worked with shovels and muscle. But the culverts never dropped. The armored crossing stalled before it truly began. Colonel Walter M. Johnson, commanding the 117th Infantry Regiment, from a forward command post thick with the smell of burnt coffee and wet wool, heard the report at 12:45 hours and understood the arithmetic immediately. His infantry would have to assault the pillbox line without a single Sherman in support. He ordered the companies already staging near the river to move out, and they did, on foot, carrying enough explosive to breach a dozen fortifications, and trusting that raw courage could somehow fill the gap their armor had left behind. Captain Spiker's Company B of the 1st Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Frankland, drew the assignment to crack the first 5 pillboxes clustered on the rising beetfield slopes south of Pallenberg just after 1300 hours. Lieutenant Cushman's 1st Platoon led the charge, and Private Brent Uenes, who had volunteered for the flamethrower mission weeks earlier after a reconnaissance patrol to the river, hugged the heavy nitrogen cylinder and sprinted toward the first box, with Private Willis Jenkins right behind him, carrying a 10-foot pole charge packed with Composition B. Uenes stopped 10 yards from the embrasure, steadied the nozzle, and sent 2 bursts of flaming diesel and gasoline directly into the slit. The instant the flame cooled, Jenkins vaulted forward, drove the pole charge through the aperture, and threw himself sideways as the pillbox erupted in a deafening white-orange blast that staggered the German survivors out the rear door, their hands raised and their voices shaking with cries of "Kamerad." Then the platoon swung toward pillbox 2, and Uenes passed the flamethrower to Private William W. Smith, a quiet replacement loader whose only distinguishing feature was the pair of K-ration boxes bulging from his hip pockets. As the squad closed the distance, a German officer emerged from pillbox 6 with a pistol swinging in his raised hand and fired 3 rounds point-blank into Smith's chest. The flamethrower tank clanged on the dirt as Smith crumpled. Uenes stumbled, jerked backward by the shoulder strap, and struggled to pull his M1 free from Smith's rigid fingers, while the officer fired 2 more shots into the fallen body. Lieutenant Cushman dropped the German with a single aimed burst, and the squad shot the fleeing officer a dozen more times before he hit the ground. Smith lay sprawled in the beet field, his face in the dirt and his helmet knocked aside, while the other men looked away and kept moving. 5 pillboxes would fall to Company B within 2 hours, but the cost already ached. The tank dozer still sits in the mud of the Worm in the mind's eye, a 22-ton bulldozer blade welded onto an M4 chassis, its tracks sheathed in thick muck, and its engine compartment open where the crew bailed out under fire. This single stuck machine, surrounded by two others sunk to their suspension, is the material anchor of the day. It represents the failure of armor, the collapse of the plan, and the moment when the infantry had to find the fight entirely inside themselves. Captain John Kent's Company A, originally held in regimental reserve, got the order to cross after Company C was pinned down south of Pallenberg. They dashed over the same bridges the bogged tanks had left behind, and a bursting shell killed Technical Sergeant Abby Revere, a key anchor for a platoon leader fresh to combat, and wounded several others who simply kept running because stopping meant dying. The new second platoon leader froze, paralyzed by the shriek of the shells, and Kent relieved him on the spot, then turned to Lieutenant Foot's 3rd platoon and said, "Take pillboxes 5 and 6. Lieutenant Foot crawled to a high point of observation, sketched the pillbox positions on the back of his map, and then led his men through a wooded draw to the riverbank, timing a 3-minute sprint across the open ground that got them to the railroad embankment with only light casualties. Stubbly, powerful Private First Class Gus Pantazopoulos anchored the bazooka team, and when the platoon reached pillbox 5, he put 2 rounds straight into the embrasure, while the support squads hosed the surrounding trenches with bare fire. Private Marvin Sirakin shoved the pole charge into the torn firing slit, and the concussion deafened the interior. A German grenade arced out and ripped a chunk from Foot's cheek, but the assault squad stormed the box anyway. Grenades into the rear door, then rifle fire into the blinded survivors, and then the dazed men filing out with arms raised. The 2nd Battalion, under Major Ammons, crossed the Worm at 14:30 to clear western Pallenberg, and the fighting instantly became house to house, men tossing grenades through shattered ground floor windows, ducking sniper bullets from upstairs, and kicking in locked doors to find cellars full of cowering civilians and hostile soldiers alike. 3 M10 tank destroyers that Colonel Johnson ordered up at 13:30 hours finally swung into position and blasted 3-inch high-explosive shells into the stone houses where German machine gunners had turned stairwells into bunkers, punching holes large enough for the infantry to pour through. In Company F, Private Harold G. Kiner saw a stick grenade drop between himself and 2 other soldiers in a narrow courtyard. He did not hesitate. Kiner threw himself chest first onto the grenade and smothered the blast with his own body, saving both men and posthumously earning the Medal of Honor, a citation that cannot capture the sound, the heat, or the sudden silence in that courtyard when the smoke cleared. South of Pallenberg, Colonel Sutherland's 119th Infantry Regiment attacked through dense Rimberg woods toward the high ground. And by noon, every company in Lieutenant Colonel Herlong's 1st Battalion was pinned flat behind the railroad embankment by machine gun fire that seemed to come from every shadow. The Rimberg Castle, a medieval stone fortress whose crenellated walls now hid automatic weapons, overlooked the entire advance, and its defenders directed a battery concentration every 5 seconds onto the American infantry crawling through the mulch and ferns. Company C reduced 1 pillbox camouflaged as a stucco house with a lucky bazooka round, but could not get another yard. The attached tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion finally crossed on a newly built treadway, only to mire in the East Bank mud, leaving Herlong's exhausted men the same brutal arithmetic that faced the 117th. Only the infantry could do the work. After dark, when the exhausted infantry dug in around their captured pillboxes, the Germans counterattacked. 2 Mark 6 Tiger tanks, with 20 grenadiers in support, ground forward toward the crossroads south of Pallenberg, and one of the behemoths halted so close to Staff Sergeant Underwood's foxhole that the muzzle brake overhung the rim by 2 feet before it fired a high-explosive round into the village. The bazooka team in the rear trench put a glancing hit on the tank's turret, and both Tigers backed away while the American riflemen engaged the German infantry in a close-range firefight that lasted mere minutes and left 7 Germans dead in front of the line, including a medic carrying a submachine gun and a satchel of grenades. Interrogations of the prisoners later revealed the attackers belonged to the 2nd Battalion, Grenadier Regiment 330, and that their commander, Hauptmann Labs, had disobeyed a direct order to attack with his entire battalion because he did not wish to earn another decoration. He wished to spare his men. The American infantry had taken 105 prisoners on the 2nd day of October, suffered 315 casualties in the rifle companies alone, and seized a bridgehead 1,200 yards deep, breaching the Siegfried line with nothing but their own nerve and the weight of the explosives they carried on their backs. Major General Leland Hobbs spent the night of 2 October hammering likely German assembly areas with every artillery tube in the 30th Infantry Division, and by first light on the 3rd, the harassing fires had slacked into a tense, damp silence. Low clouds and a cold drizzle blurred the slag heaps and pillboxes, giving the exhausted rifle companies a few hours to redistribute ammunition and count their losses. The 1st Battalion of the 117th Infantry had seized a fragile bridgehead south of Pallenberg, but the tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion were still mired in the grey worm clay, and the 119th Infantry remained pinned behind the railroad embankment. Its attack on the Rimberg Woods completely stalled. Colonel Walter M. Johnson knew he had to pry the advance loose before the Germans could mass reserves, so he ordered Lieutenant Colonel Samuel McDowell's 3rd Battalion to push east at dawn and seize the mining town of Ubach, the original D-Day objective. But first, the 119th Infantry needed relief on its left flank, and that problem belonged to the regimental executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel W. Quinn, a lean, deliberate officer who now received orders to form a fast-moving task force, punch through the 117th sector and take the Rimberg Woods from the rear. Quinn assembled his ad hoc command with the speed of a man who understood that hesitation cost lives. He took Captain Robert B. McBride's Company B and Captain Earl J. Palmer Jr.'s Company I riflemen, who had been waiting in reserve, along with a platoon of 11 Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion and 2 platoons of tank destroyers. Their route would snake north along the west bank of the Worm, hidden from direct observation, then cross the Marienburg footbridges into Pallenberg and wheel south. At 0900 hours, Quinn briefed his company commanders in a battered shed near the river. The tanks would lead down the open ground east of the woods. The infantry would clear the pillboxes from behind, and the tank destroyers would shield the left flank. The task force started moving just before 1000 hours, and almost immediately the plan buckled. German artillery observers on the high ground spotted the armored column, and a fresh volley of 150mm shells forced the infantry to ground west of the river. Worse, pillboxes that the 117th had cleared the day before had been quietly reoccupied during the night. Small arms fire crackled from positions only 200 yards away. Quinn had to call back the infantry of the 117th to flush the Germans out before his own men could cross, and it was 10:50 hours before the Shermans finally growled into Pallenberg, their tracks chewing through the wet rubble. Once across, Task Force Quinn turned south and struck the factory district with sudden brute momentum. The tanks rolled alongside the infantry, blasting apertures, while McBride's riflemen rushed the rear doors with grenades and satchel charges, and within 2 hours the force had captured 135 prisoners and silenced the pillboxes that had been pouring fire into the northern boundary of the 119th Infantry sector. The pressure lifted palpably on Lieutenant Colonel Herlong's exhausted 1st Battalion, and for the first time in 2 days, the men pinned behind the railroad embankment heard enemy machine gun fire slacken. Quinn radioed Colonel Sutherland at 1300 hours and reported that his lead elements were deep in the woods south of the Rimberg-Merkstein-Hofstadt road. Sutherland, mindful of overextension, warned him not to get too far off the high ground, but the relief was real, and Sutherland immediately ordered Herlong to push through the woods and make contact with the task force. Captain McBride's Company B, fighting pillbox to pillbox on the western half of the woods, paused only to evacuate a medic, Private Joseph P. Melhelich, who had been wounded twice, in the leg and shoulder, yet still crawled about under fire, bandaging 6 other men, and refused to withdraw until he had arranged litters for the worst of them. Then, at 15:22 hours, Sutherland dissolved Task Force Quinn. He ordered McBride's Company B and the tank platoon to revert to Herlong's 1st Battalion and Palmer's Company I to return to the 3rd Battalion. The order made a certain tactical sense. The command relationships had been temporary, and the regiment needed to consolidate, but it also halted the attack at the moment of its deepest penetration. McBride later judged that if the task force had been allowed to press on, it would have cleared the woods by dark. Instead, the lead elements halted, and the Germans bought 90 minutes to reorganize. Those 90 minutes proved murderous. When Companies A and C of the 1st Battalion finally attacked eastward across the railroad tracks, they walked into a concentration that had been carefully re-registered on the tree line. An enemy battery dropped a volley every 5 seconds for 40 minutes. Tree bursts sent shards of wood and hot steel down into the foxholes, and Company C's advance stalled 20 yards beyond the line Captain McBride had held. Captain Simmons's Company A, down to half its strength, could add almost nothing. The 1st Battalion dug in where it crouched, the Rimberg woods still uncut. The promise of Task Force Quinn dissolved like the afternoon fog. While Quinn's task force fought in the south, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel McDowell's 3rd Battalion of the 117th Infantry had launched its own grinding assault into Ubak. Company K, led by Captain Wayne Culp, the man Johnson called Wild Man Culp, pushed up the main street from the west, while Company L flanked to the north. The Germans had bolted the house doors, so tanks first fired high explosive rounds to blow them open. And then the riflemen went in with bayonets and grenades. But the advance slowed to a crawl by 1300 hours. The enemy had registered their mortars on every intersection, and a pillbox on higher ground kept up a steady enfilading fire from the 119th Infantry sector. An anti-tank platoon under Lieutenant Robert Peters solved the pillbox problem with a piece of pure gunnery, from a range of 300 yards, with his 57mm gun barely clearing a small ridge. Peters put a second-round hit straight through the firing slit. The top of the concrete caved inward. One German bolted out and was cut down by high explosive fire, and the enfilading stopped. But by now the roads into Ubak were choked with the armor of Combat Command B, 2nd Armored Division, Shermans, half-tracks, and support vehicles weaving through the same narrow streets the infantry were fighting to clear. Colonel Johnson watched the congestion spread and felt his temper fray. At 13:25 hours, he snapped to his staff that the tanks were messing around a little bit, but mainly sitting there, and added, "Somebody has got to move Powerhouse." But Ubak was too small for 2 commands, and coordination between the infantry battalion commander and the armored task force commander took precious hours. Not until late afternoon did the Shermans and riflemen disentangle enough to push deeper into the eastern half of town. And by 1840 hours, Johnson ordered McDowell to button up short of his objective. The eastern half of Ubak remained in German hands. To the south, Lieutenant Colonel William M. Cox's 2nd Battalion of the 119th Infantry faced a different and more ancient obstacle. Rimberg Castle, a medieval stone fortress whose crenellated walls now housed automatic weapons and forward artillery observers. Captain Toller's Company E and Captain Reich's Company F approached from the west, crossing the Worm and moving up a narrow sunken road, lined with 10 enemy machine guns and a full infantry platoon dug in along the castle wall. Drew Middleton, watching the fight for his newspaper, later wrote that the old dark castle seemed to be seeping smoke from every slit that forgotten masons had cut for medieval archers. For 40 savage minutes, the 2nd Battalion crawled and sprinted across the open ground, the air cracking with automatic fire and the crash of shells. Captain Reich, a spare, quiet man who carried an old Springfield bolt-action rifle with a telescopic sight, balanced his weapon on the spokes of a hayrake's wheel and squeezed the trigger once. A German soldier 200 yards distant tumbled into the Worm. Moments later, a shell fragment killed Reich where he stood in the big double doorway of a U-shaped barn, his executive officer, Lieutenant Edward Arnn, at his side. The battalion mourned, but the attack did not pause. Lieutenant Masonheimer's 1st Platoon of Company F found the stone-arched main gate and charged through it. And the Americans went into the castle room by room with grenades and bayonets, fighting under chandeliers and through medieval corridors, until by 20:45 hours, the fortress was empty of living Germans and ringed by American infantry and tanks. Nightfall on 3 October did not bring rest. The German artillery stepped up its tempo, and every American soldier in the bridgehead knew from hard experience that the barrage signaled an impending counterattack. The first blow came at 0400 hours on 4 October, when 2 Mark IV tanks and a company of grenadiers hit Company L of the 3rd Battalion, 117th Infantry in Ubak. Start. The specialized not. Start. cutting off the 3rd platoon and isolating a weapons platoon in a stone house. The cut-off men held out, firing from windows and upper floors, but the tanks walked their machine gun fire across every aperture, and the bazooka teams were picked off one by German riflemen. The situation was unraveling until Lieutenant Robert C. Burke, a forward artillery observer from Battery C of the 118th Field Artillery, left his covered position and sprinted through a street swept by direct tank fire. He reached the 3rd floor of a building, found it already occupied by Germans, fought his way out, and climbed to the 3rd floor of another structure, where he called in adjustments by radio. A 105mm round struck a Mark IV turret squarely and blew it apart, and as Shermans from the 2nd Armored Division re-entered the town from the north, the German infantry withdrew. The isolated weapons platoon crawled out of their shell-battered house, carrying their wounded, and the line held. Simultaneously, a second and more devastating counterattack rolled into the Rimberg woods. At 0500 hours, Mark IV tanks and assault guns preceded 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 149th Regiment, and they struck Captain Palmer's Company I with concentrated fury. Palmer's command group had to abandon their pillbox command post and run. Many of the men were captured or killed, including a forward observer, Lieutenant Seymour Scheffrin, who had been wounded in both legs, his left arm, and his face. Scheffrin refused evacuation, and from a nearby knoll he tried to adjust fire by the sound of German voices. His eyesight dimmed almost to blindness. When the German assault swept over him, his last words over the radio were a call for more fire on his own position. Company I was decimated, but the German wave broke against a wall of fire put down by the men who held the next line. Private First Class Harmon Butler and Private First Class Ray Tucker, heavy weapons men attached to Company C, left their foxholes to man their machine guns despite the intensity of the enemy barrage. Small arms fire struck both gun cradles, damaging them so badly that the weapons could only be traversed by dragging their tripods from side to side. Yet Butler and Tucker kept firing, fed ammunition by Private Samuel Breyer, who ran back and forth under cratering fire. Together they poured 5,500 rounds into the advancing German infantry, piling bodies as close as 15 yards from the American foxholes, and when the fighter-bombers of the 9th Air Force arrived at 0940 hours and caught the German armor in the open, the counterattack collapsed. The cost was brutal. Company E of the 119th Infantry lost its executive officer and 10 other men. Company F had just 16 soldiers left in its first platoon by nightfall. Captain Palmer's company, I was essentially gone. 1 officer remained. And the company had been practically all captured or killed, yet the Germans had not retaken an inch of permanently held ground, and their own losses were immense. American artillery observers noted German dead stacked in the draw near Pallenberg and scattered in heaps along the edge of the woods, and prisoner interrogations later identified the attackers as elements of the 219th Engineer Battalion, and units rushed from the 49th and 246th Divisions. That night, the German High Command finally grasped the scale of the threat. General der Infanterie Friedrich Köchling, commanding LXXI Corps, ordered 3 units from the 12th Infantry Division to the Übach area, a Landeskreuzern Battalion, an assault gun brigade, and a howitzer battalion, and from Aachen, he pulled an anti-tank company and a tank company equipped with remote-controlled robotic assault guns. Field Marshal Model and General der Panzertruppe, Brandenburger, commander of the 7th Army, visited Köchling's command post in Niedersee and promised still more. NCO trainees from Düren and Jülich, a fortress machine gun battalion, an artillery brigade with 27 150mm guns and 32 88mm anti-aircraft weapons. By 6 October, Köchling expected to mass nearly 120 artillery tubes against the American bridgehead. But it was General Lieutenant McCulse of the 49th Division who read the true portent. From entries on a map captured during the counterattacks, a standard American operations overlay, he saw, with cold clarity, that the enemy intended to continue the attack toward Alsdorf, with the aim of encircling Aachen from the north and east, while covering his left flank toward the west. The map showed the 30th Infantry Division's phase lines swinging south like a closing jaw, and McCulse understood that his own division would be rolled up from the north if those lines were reached. The west wall had been breached, the bridgehead was expanding, and Aachen, the ancient imperial city, was the target. The morning of 5 October broke with a hazy sky and the promise of clearing weather. Across the American bridgehead rifle companies shuffled ammunition forward, reorganized shattered platoons, and waited for the heavy artillery to lift. Lieutenant Colonel William M. Cox surveyed the eastern ridge south of Übach, with a map spread across the hood of a jeep. His 2nd Battalion would resume the attack toward Herbach, and he had decided the lead would fall to Company E under Lieutenant Parker. Parker chose his 2nd and 3rd platoons for the assault, then faced a harsh truth. His company had no flamethrowers and no pole charges. The morning's mission required reducing a dozen pillboxes, and without the specialized tools that had cracked the first belt of fortifications, he would have to improvise. 7 Shermans and 4 tank destroyers stood by, their engines rumbling in the damp air, and Parker intended to use them as the primary breaching weapon. Sergeant Harold Hollycross, a steady Indiana native with a square jaw and dirt-rimmed fingernails, commanded the 2nd platoon. At 0700 hours, when the tanks lurched forward, Hollycross directed 1 Sherman to lay a mixture of white phosphorus and high explosive onto the first pillbox, the rounds slamming into the concrete aperture and sending ricochets skittering across the communications trenches. While the Germans inside cowered, Hollycross sprinted 40 yards with 4 men directly under the trajectory of their own friendly fire, a tactic learned through bitter experience in the previous day's fighting. Anti-phosphorus smoke and concussion stunned the occupants. When Hollycross and his small squad closed to within 100 yards, he signaled to lift the armor's fire. Private First Class John Perez dashed the last stretch and hurled a grenade into the embrasure. When the smoke cleared, a white flag wobbled from the rear doorway, and a dozen Germans filed out with trembling hands. Hollycross shouted a terse order to send the prisoners rearward and pressed toward the next box. Parker had instructed Hollycross to use the same method on every pillbox in their path, and for over 2 hours the process repeated with brutal efficiency. The tank gunners roamed their fire from one concrete dome to the next, each box shuddering under the impact. Hollycross and his men, never more than a squad in strength, dodged the shrapnel and rushed forward in the seconds after the fire lifted. In one pillbox after another, frightened Germans surrendered with hands high before the Americans could toss a satchel charge. Word of Hollycross's success crackled over Parker's radio, and the company commander moved into a captured box to use as a forward command post. The 3rd platoon, under Lieutenant Macaulay, had reduced 2 pillboxes on the left by the same method, and the crews of the supporting Shermans grew bolder as the morning wore on. By 0900, Hollycross's group alone had captured 8 pillboxes and herded 50 prisoners down the ridge, a tally that exceeded the company's remaining combat strength. The advance slowed just short of Herbach, where a wooded draw concealed 2 more pillboxes, and the American tanks burned through the last of their high-explosive ammunition. Parker radioed Cox and requested permission to push deeper, but the lieutenant colonel told him to hold. No more tanks could be resupplied until nightfall. The final pillboxes would wait for tomorrow. But the morning's work had proven that Shermans could substitute for flamethrowers when infantrymen dared to run alongside their own shellfire. Farther south, in the dark tangle of the Rimberg Woods, the 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry had been stuck for days, bleeding officers and men against pillboxes hidden among the splintered trees. Captain Robert B. McBride of Company B had grown frustrated with the indecisive progress of Lieutenant Bonds's Company C on his left, and he spent the early morning of 5 October devising a more aggressive plan. He would use flamethrowers, which had already proven their psychological power, but he had no trained operators among his thinning ranks. McBride requested 2 flamethrowers from Lieutenant Colonel Herlong, and at 11:30 hours an engineer platoon leader arrived with the weapons, along with the unsettling news that General Hobbs had forbidden engineers from manning the devices in combat. Undeterred, McBride pulled 4 of his own riflemen, handed them the ungainly cylinders, and had the engineers provide hasty instructions on triggers and fuel mixtures. He then briefed his 2 remaining platoon leaders in a captured pillbox and stressed that speed, simultaneity, and sheer shock would carry the assault. The attack ripped forward at noon with rifle squads pouring marching fire into the German trenches while the 2 flamethrower men sprinted ahead. Liquid fire gushed into the embrasure of the nearest pillbox, and within seconds a German soldier, his uniform blazing, burst screaming from the rear door, his flight igniting chaos among the defenders. The effect was instantaneous. Other occupants broke for the second box, and the Americans followed, slamming satchel charges against rear doors and dropping grenades down ventilator shafts. McBride's men advanced 200 yards before German artillery found them, tree bursts showering the undergrowth with hot steel and forcing the company to ground. But they had broken the stalemate. Prisoners stumbled past, still shaking from the flames. Replacements arrived that evening, 22 men for Company B, 18 for Lieutenant Bonds's Company C, bringing the rifle companies back to something resembling combat strength, though all three remained below half of their authorized rosters. Dawn of 6 October brought a thick, low fog to the western approaches of Herbach, and with it came a German counterpunch that the weary 2nd Battalion had learned to expect. Just before daylight, 2 Mark VI Tiger tanks and a company of assault troops emerged from the mist and hit the pillboxes that Parker's Company E had so carefully captured the morning before. The Germans had watched and learned. They fired their tank cannons directly into the pillbox apertures, threw smoke and grenades through the blasted openings, and rushed the stunned Americans before they could respond. Parker's entire 1st and 3rd platoons, pinned inside their own fortifications, were forced to surrender. The Tigers turned toward the woods on the battalion's left, their long 88mm guns swinging toward the boxes held by Lieutenant Edward Arndt's Company F. Company E, evaporated within an hour. Its morning report strength of 165 soldiers collapsed to 35. Only Sergeant Hollycross, in a different sector, retained enough men to constitute a single platoon. Lieutenant Arn, a lean man with a laconic voice, found himself commanding from a pillbox on the edge of the woods, while 2 Mark V Panthers and a wave of infantry bore toward his position. His 300 radio crackled with calls for tank support, but the Shermans were still refueling. A runner named Private Sewell dodged the enemy fire to reach him, and Arn immediately started calling down artillery concentrations from an exposed trench outside the box, adjusting the fire by the sound of the 105mm shells ripping through the tree canopy. Arn climbed onto the roof of his pillbox and stood in the open with a tank approaching. When radio contact failed, he began directing the Sherman commander, Lieutenant Walter D. Macht with broad hand motions, pointing toward the northeast edge of the woods where the German tanks lurked. Macht's gunner pumped 15 rounds into the tree line, and 1 Panther staggered, trailed oily smoke, and withdrew. Arn jumped down as German machine gun rounds clipped the concrete where he had been standing. The real fight erupted when German infantry closed to small arms range, a skirmish line advancing through the underbrush. Arn had just 25 men remaining, and they were slow to open fire until their commander shouted for an M1, the words jolting the line into a sudden, furious volley. Private Floyd J. McCullough swung a machine gun onto the enemy column and held the trigger until the last German fell. Other men in the trenches sighted along their garrons and dropped the survivors. High overhead, 9 P-38 fighters from the 9th Air Force, called in by Cox, caught another formation of tanks and infantry massing near a coal pile south of the woods. The bombs cratered the approach, and 3 Tigers were later found with their hulls split and blackened. By 1910 hours, every pillbox lost in the morning had been retaken. Though the battalion's rifle companies were hollow shells, Company F ended the day with 23 enlisted men and 2 officers. Company E with barely a platoon. The same dawn that brought the counterattack on Cox's battalion also delivered a long-awaited opportunity to Herlong's 1st Battalion in the Rimberg Woods. For 5 days, the companies had clawed at the fortifications, losing friends with every futile rush toward the tree line. But at 0700 on 6 October, an engineering team cut a passage through the blown railroad underpass, and a platoon of Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion finally rumbled into the woods to support an attack. McBride seized the moment, with tanks firing directly into the western fringes of the remaining pillboxes. His Company B cleared the last enemy positions in its zone and broke out onto the Rimberg-Merkstein-Hofstadt road. The company's executive officer, Lieutenant Kenneth R. Noe, was killed by a sniper's bullet during the final rush. Technical Sergeant Adrian F. Vetter died beside him, and the loss cut deep among the men who had served with them since Normandy. McBride felt the fury but did not let it slow the advance. When Company C lagged again, he ordered his left platoon to swing east and take over its mission, extending the battalion's front until Company C could catch up. By 1400 hours, the woods were entirely free of German defenders. By 1630, Merkstein-Hofstadt was captured, with 15 more prisoners rounded up from the factory district at the southern edge of town. The battalion dug in at 1830, exhausted but finally standing on open ground. Lieutenant Colonel Herlong looked at the tally and the butcher's bill in the same moment. Over 5 days, his 1st Battalion had stormed an open river crossing, seized 19 pillboxes, captured an entire town and a factory, and taken 245 prisoners. The cost was written in the morning reports: 354 casualties among the rifle companies. McBride, who had driven every assault, lost 2 of his closest friends. The next morning, 7 October, brought a dramatic change to the American bridgehead. The sky cleared and the temperature rose, and for the first time in a week fighter bombers could operate freely over the front. Colonel Walter M. Johnson, whose 117th Infantry Regiment had been straddling Übach for days, now had orders to strike directly for Alsdorf, a coal mining town that sat astride one of the 2 major highways leading northeast from Aachen. Johnson wanted speed, and he got it by putting tanks in the lead and telling his infantry to stay close behind. Companies I and L of Lieutenant Colonel Samuel McDowell's 3rd Battalion kicked off at 0700, supported by a platoon of Shermans moving cross-country at less than 300 yards ahead of the infantry. The tanks sprayed every German foxhole with machine gun fire, and the riflemen, jogging in the cover of the armored bulk, caught enemy soldiers in their sleeping positions, inside farmhouses and beatfield dugouts. Lieutenant Richard C. Timp's 1st Platoon, Company I, and Lieutenant Gail Dougherty's 2nd Platoon, Company L, bet each other on who would reach the town first. It was later judged a tie. The advance covered 5,000 yards in under 3 hours, the Shermans rolling through the crossroads at 10:30 hours, while the last German defenders, caught completely unprepared, threw their hands into the air or bolted toward the distant Aachen road. When Company A, under Captain John Kent, entered Alsdorf from the northwest a short time later, the men found a strange, unsettling silence. The streets were empty, the doors shut, the entire population having vanished into their cellars. Kent later recalled that the quiet was so absolute it scared him. And airstrike scheduled for 10:30 hours arrived moments later. 15 P-47s that spotted the orange signal panels the infantry had spread atop the lead tanks and swerved away from the town to bomb a retreating German column near a slag heap. Kent's men had captured 100 prisoners on the way, many of them taken without a fight. By noon, the 117th Infantry stood on the southeastern edge of Alsdorf, its right flank anchored by Captain Kent's company facing the Aachen road, its left flank jutting into open farmland where the adjacent regiment had not yet caught up. South of Alsdorf, the German line collapsed in rapid sequence. Colonel Sutherland's 119th Infantry, reinforced by the attached 3rd Battalion of the 120th Infantry, swept through Merkstein and netted 406 prisoners, including a battalion commander and his entire staff. Lieutenant Colonel Brown's 3rd Battalion cleared 20 pillboxes in a single afternoon, such an enormous haul that every man collected a pistol, a map case, or a wristwatch from the pile of surrendered equipment. Prisoners kept filing in all night. By nightfall, the bridgehead measured nearly 6 miles in length and over 4.5 miles in depth, a monstrous bulge in the Siegfried line that the German reserves could not pinch shut. Major General Leland Hobbs, standing at his forward command post with the day's reports spread before him, reached for the field telephone and called General Corlett. "The job is finished as far as this division is concerned," Hobbs declared. "We have a hole in this thing big enough to drive 2 divisions through." Lieutenant Colonel McDowell's 3rd Battalion dug in to hold Alsdorf through the coming storms. Captain Kent's Company A anchored the flank facing the Aachen road, and the exhausted 119th Infantry linked with the 1st Division, forming the outer ring of the encirclement. The Cygnet Corps was now set to close the trap around Aachen. A low-hanging thick mist clung to the battlefield before dawn on 8 October, muffling sound and swallowing the rooftops of Alsdorf. Out of that mist, Regiment von Fritzschen, rushed 100 miles from Luxembourg and delayed by road congestion, finally launched its counterattack to retake the town at all costs. At mid-morning, German artillery crashed into the southeastern edge of Alsdorf, and then enemy infantry riding 4 Mark IV tanks swept out of the haze toward the command post of Lieutenant Colonel Samuel McDowell's 3rd Battalion. Far to the south, on the bare slopes of Crucifix Hill, Lieutenant Joseph W. Cameron was killed moments earlier, while trying to drag a wounded sergeant to cover, and the Ranger platoon, though battered, had already taken its assigned pillbox. McDowell, commanding from the 3rd floor of a 3-story schoolhouse, watched a company of grenadiers and the panzers close on his position through the grey murk. He had only his M1 rifle, his radio operator, Private Roy C. Wheeler, and Lieutenant Buran at his side. The tank destroyer's prime mover was already burning in the street behind them. As 1 Mark IV rumbled past the schoolhouse, McDowell shot 4 Germans dead and wounded 3 more. Buran dropped 5, Wheeler added 2. On the lower floors, the WWII team, runners, and scouts, fired from every window, their combined small arms fire shredding the attackers who tried to encircle the building. Then came the roar of Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion. Sergeant Donald L. Mason in Tank A-16 had spotted the enemy armor and called in friendly armor, and within minutes, 3 German tanks were burning in the streets. One Mark IV survived to roam Alsdorf all day, dodging every trap and earning the weary nickname the Reluctant Dragon. But by noon, the counterattack on the schoolhouse had been shattered. While McDowell was holding his command post, the 117th Infantry Regiment's attack southeastward toward Mariadorf was grinding to a bloody halt. Lieutenant George Thompson's company, I pushed out of Alsdorf behind a platoon of Shermans. But when anti-tank fire knocked out 3 of the tanks, the infantry found themselves pinned in the open by a German machine gun on a slag pile beside a coal mine. The dismounted tank crews grabbed rifles and fought as infantry, and Thompson's 1st platoon, under Lieutenant Richard C. Timpe, was practically wiped out. Only 6 men would return that night. Then a German officer rose to his full height, and with a theatrical wave, led his men forward in a textbook skirmish line. Company I held its fire, waited until the line was 50 yards away, and opened with every weapon, cutting down the attackers in a heap. Later in the afternoon, enemy soldiers wearing captured American uniforms tried to infiltrate the company's left flank, but they gave themselves away with their yellow ammunition boxes and were mowed down at close range. When dusk finally allowed the battalion to pull back north of the railroad tracks, only 33 men from Company I rallied, half a squad at a time, crawling rearward under rolling artillery barrages. 20 miles to the south, well before dawn that same morning, 11 battalions of American artillery erupted against Verlautenheide, the opening blow of the 1st Infantry Division's southern pincer to encircle Aachen. At 0400 hours, the 2nd Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment attacked out of Eilendorf, with Captain Alfred Koenig's Company F leading on the right through the darkness and fog. A sergeant's overly loud shout gave away the company's position, and the night sky blossomed with German parachute flares before a machine gun scattered Koenig's command group in 3 directions. Koenig lost his radio, but dashed left, collected stray soldiers, surprised a German patrol, and personally killed every man in it. Then organized his men for the house-to-house brawl that would consume the village until dawn. The tank support that was supposed to follow was gutted by mines, artillery, and panzerfausts. Only 1 Sherman remained operational, and that tank crawled into an orchard to wait out the engineers clearing the roads. But Lieutenant Emmett Duffy's tank destroyers arrived instead, putting 14 rapid rounds into the pillbox embrasures on the ridge, while squads from Captain Herschel Kaufmann's Company E rushed the rear doors with pole and satchel charges. By midday, Verlautenheide was firmly in American hands, though German shells continued to slam into the rubble every few seconds. Lieutenant Colonel John H. Leonard, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry, received orders to move his men up through the shell-torn streets and prepare for the assault on Crucifix Hill. Leonard personally led his command group forward, fighting through houses still sheltering German stragglers with carbines and grenades until they seized a forward command post on the extreme western edge of the village. From here, Captain Bobbie Brown of Company C huddled his young soldiers in cellars and studied the aerial photographs. A bare ridge rising to a nearly 800-foot summit, crowned with a 60-foot stone cross, studded with 40 pillboxes, every aperture angled to cover the open ground they would have to cross. The scheduled airstrike and artillery barrage pounded Crucifix Hill at 13:30 hours, but the German defenders simply huddled inside their concrete bunkers and emerged the moment the fire lifted, their machine guns and 20mm cannons snarling down the slope. Brown's 2 assault platoons were immediately pinned at the base of the hill, and when his radio operator relayed that no one was moving, the captain crawled into a muddy ditch and reached for a satchel charge. "I guess I'll just have to take them myself," Brown said. He crawled alone toward the nearest pillbox. The rear door was blocked by a rifle. The hot metal of the rear door seared his palm as he reached for the fuse. He opened it and pulled the fuse on a 60-quarter-pound block charge. He tossed the charge inside, then slammed the door and jumped away as the pillbox erupted. He then sprinted back for another charge, crawled up a 100-foot slope under continuous machine gun fire, and unable to reach the rear door, rose and charged the front aperture. Hurling a satchel of TNT into the firing slit, and diving into a crater as the pillbox detonated behind him. Wounded twice now, with a gash in his knee and fragments in his arm and chin, Brown worked his way to the summit and the largest pillbox, a low concrete fortress, with a revolving turret mounting an 88mm gun and 4 machine guns. He waited at the heavy steel rear door until a German soldier emerged carrying ammunition. Then Brown lunged, dropped a lit satchel charge at the man's feet, slammed the door and sprinted down the reverse slope as the explosion tore through the bunker's interior. Machine gun fire nicked his arm as he scouted the far side of the hill, but he scrambled back to find 3 more pillboxes already reduced by his rising assault squads. The massive stone cross, used by German forward observers for years, had toppled during the bombardment, its shattered base lying across a crater, and in just 40 minutes the entire summit was in American hands. When Leonard received the news, he stood incredulous. Brown simply reported, "It was the only job they expected us to do." That night, under a rain-soaked sky, the Germans threw 3 waves of infantry and assault engineers against Crucifix Hill, hoping to take it back in the darkness. Brown ordered his men to hold fire until the attackers were nearly on top of the foxholes. Then, as artillery flares and illuminating shells silhouetted the masses, every rifle and machine gun opened with grazing fire. Lieutenant Thomas Yarbour's heavy machine guns from Company D swept the slope, and in the brief, savage firefight that followed, more than 100 Germans were cut down within 75 yards of the line. 40 dead were counted within rock-throwing distance. Prisoners identified the attackers as companies of Pioneer Battalion 12 and Fusilier Regiment 27, the expected saviors of Aachen, now broken. Simultaneously, a battalion-sized German force hit Verlautenheide, closing to within 40 yards of the battalion command post before 5 Shermans and 4 tank destroyers raced to the scene and fired at everything on the street until the attack collapsed. By 08:30 the next morning, the line held firm across the ridge, and the northern jaw of the Aachen encirclement was closed. Then the distinctive clatter of armored vehicles cut through the din, and 5 Shermans and 4 tank destroyers rumbled into the square beside the command post. Their commander ordered them to shoot at everything on the far side of the street, and the night erupted with the concussion of 75mm and 76mm guns pumping high explosive shells into every building that could conceal an enemy. 1 tank destroyer had its radiator ripped open by a shell fragment, but the crew kept fighting, hosing upper stories with machine gun tracers that stitched orange lines across the darkness. By 8:30 that morning, the counterattack had broken. 75 Germans were taken prisoner, the rest retreating over piles of their own dead, and the line at Verlautenheide held firm. On Hill 192, the 3rd Battalion of the 18th Infantry absorbed its own pre-dawn punishment as German artillery and mortars pounded the ridgeline for a solid hour. Infantrymen huddled in their foxholes with dirt cascading down their necks, and when the shelling lifted, they could hear the rustle of field gear and the click of rifle bolts as enemy squads infiltrated forward through the gloom. Sergeant William A. Nickel, a tank destroyer commander whose vehicle was positioned just below the crest, traversed his 50 caliber machine gun and opened fire, the heavy rounds chewing through the underbrush and dropping the lead grenadiers before they could close to grenade range. Company M's 81mm mortars added their heavy thump to the defense, walking shells downhill into the advancing skirmish line, and when the survivors pressed close enough for the rifle companies to see the shapes of their helmets, the Americans unleashed their final protective fires. M1s and bars fired at point-blank range, the muzzle flashes illuminating tight-lipped faces behind the sights, and the counterattack collapsed into a scattering of dead and wounded in the tall grass. Meanwhile, in the northern section of Rothe-Erde, Company L finally overwhelmed the last German holdouts in the sprawling rubber factory. When the firing stopped, men climbed to the factory roof and saw, through the haze, the grey spires and shattered rooftops of central Aachen itself. The 1st Division now had observation over the entire city. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Leonard climbed Crucifix Hill, accompanied by Captain McGregor, his operations officer, and Captain Miller, who commanded Company B. They found a place among the smashed pillboxes where they could glass the ground to the northwest, and through their binoculars the Ravensburg rose before them, a dark, wooded mass nearly a mile and a half distant. Its slopes thick with trees and undergrowth that swallowed every feature and made it impossible to count pillboxes or gauge troop strength. The Aachen-Würselen road lay in the open ground between, and even now German military traffic was streaming along it, trucks and horse-drawn carts carrying supplies into the encircled city. Leonard studied the terrain with an intensity that silenced everyone around him. The only viable approach was a bare ridgeline that fell away from Crucifix Hill, across the big road, through an orchard, and up the southern slope of the Ravensberg. And it was completely exposed for nearly a mile. He weighed the odds of a daylight assault and dismissed them immediately. Instead, he decided on a night infiltration, something the battalion had never attempted on this scale. There would be no artillery preparation to alert the defenders, no wire communications to risk detection, and complete radio silence until first contact. Just two reinforced rifle companies moving in single file through absolute darkness, their lives depending on speed, silence, and nerve. At 7:55 that evening, Captain Miller's Company B formed up on the western slope of Crucifix Hill, each man loaded with rifle, ammunition bandoliers, grenades, and sections of mortars and light machine guns. Behind them, Captain Hess brought up Company I, and in the thickening dark, the long column began to descend. They moved in total blackness. No moon, no stars, each soldier gripping the pack of the man in front of him to stay connected. The only sound the scuff of boots on dirt and the occasional clink of a loose entrenching tool. Miller, walking at the head of the column, navigated by compass, and by his memory of the terrain features he had studied from atop the hill hours before. When he reached the Aachen road, he heard the tramp of boots approaching from the northeast, and he froze, passing the signal back through the column with a raised hand. His men dropped silently into the roadside ditch and lay motionless as a German infantry unit marched past in the darkness. So close they could smell the soldiers' damp wool and hear the creak of their leather equipment. An American reaching out could have grabbed a German boot. The enemy column disappeared into the gloom toward Aachen, utterly unaware of the hundreds of Americans lying at arm's reach, and Miller began infiltrating his men across the road in small groups. The crossing was a masterpiece of nerve. At one point, a horse-drawn cart with two German soldiers sitting on the driver's bench halted inexplicably in the middle of the road, and a full platoon crossed directly in front of the animal without a challenge or a shot fired. Whether the Germans were asleep, drunk, or simply never imagined Americans could be there, no one ever learned. It took nearly 2 hours for all 300 men to reach the far side, and when the last squad slipped into the orchard beyond, Miller and Hess reformed the column and began the silent push toward the foot of the Ravensberg. They ghosted past a line of pillboxes so close that they could hear Germans inside, casual voices and the scrape of a chair, and 3 enemy soldiers sat atop one concrete emplacement, smoking and talking in low tones, the orange tips of their cigarettes glowing in the dark. Another group of 6 or 8 men was spotted walking parallel to the column, their silhouettes briefly visible against the night sky. The Americans used a repurposed communication wire stretched back hundreds of feet as a handrail, each man keeping a loose grip on the insulated line to maintain direction without speaking. By midnight they had reached the base of the hill, and the silence was so complete it was unsettling. No sentry challenges, no barking dogs, just the whisper of wind through the pines, and the distant crump of artillery far to the south. Miller set up a perimeter, and the men began systematically searching the pillboxes. In one concrete bunker, they found a German regimental commander and his entire reconnaissance party sound asleep on bunks, their boots off, weapons stacked in a corner. They were prisoners before they fully understood they were awake, hands raised in the pale beam of a hooded flashlight, and more boxes were cleared as the long night wore on, one after another. The sleeping occupants startled into capture without a shot being fired. By 8 o'clock on the morning of October 10th, every fortification on the Ravensberg was in American hands. Not a single round had been expended. As dawn broke over the hill, a detail of 4 Germans approached through the trees carrying containers of hot breakfast for their comrades. They walked directly into an American perimeter and were absorbed into the growing number of prisoners, their meal now in the hands of hungry infantrymen who had eaten nothing but cold rations for days. Later, 8 Germans left a nearby chateau and strode toward a bunker for a morning meeting with the captured regimental commander. And an American rifleman crouched behind a stone wall cut 4 of them down with his Browning automatic rifle. A lieutenant colonel and 2 sergeants threw their hands up. Throughout the morning, more stragglers wandered in, and all were taken. Leonard had spent an agonizing night with no communication. Miller had made only one brief radio report when the column first crossed the big road, then nothing. When the word finally came that the Ravensberg was secure, that it had been taken without a fight, the exhausted battalion commander unleashed a string of profanity and then grinned. He had gambled on stealth, and the gamble had paid off completely. Hess shifted his men into positions with direct observation over the Aachen-Würselen road, and the Americans could now see every German truck and wagon that tried to move along the last supply artery into the city. That artery was now clamped shut. With the Ravensburg secured, the 18th Infantry linked its lines from Crucifix Hill to the new positions, and the jaw of the encirclement closed. The 1st Division stood shoulder to shoulder on high ground overlooking Aachen, and the city was completely cut off. No more ammunition wagons, no more food convoys, no more replacements filtering in under cover of darkness. The Americans had paid for this ground with terrible losses. Captain Cambron and 5 enlisted men killed, 2 officers and 33 men wounded on Crucifix Hill alone. And across the entire front, the rifle companies of the 30th Division had been bled white. The 1st Battalion, 119th Infantry, had taken 354 casualties in just 5 days. The stage was set for the ultimatum to surrender, and if the German garrison refused, for the final assault into the ancient imperial city. Captain Bobbie Brown, recovering from the wounds he had taken on Crucifix Hill, did not yet know that his actions were being written up for the Medal of Honor, a citation that would eventually bring him to the White House, where President Harry Truman would tell him he would have traded places with him. But the men who had fought beside him already understood. One soldier described watching Brown charge across an open field into a storm of fire, and later wrote that he was worth a regiment, a sentiment echoed by General Hübner and by every infantryman who had seen what one determined man could do against concrete and steel. The road to the Rhine was still long, but the first great German city had fallen under an American noose, and its defenders had no way out. Lieutenant Colonel John H. Leonard returned to a quiet command post on Crucifix Hill and began planning the defense of his newly extended line. He had seen his battalion claw its way through Verlottenheide, storm the bare slopes of Crucifix Hill, and then ghost through the German lines to seize the last high ground in silence. 3 radically different battles in 3 days, and his men had prevailed in all of them. Outside, the captured German regimental commander sat on an ammunition crate under guard, still blinking in the daylight, and the smell of the German breakfast drifted through the crisp October air, an improbable, intimate reminder that this hill, now utterly quiet, had been enemy territory just hours before. In the aftermath, the Americans tallied their losses. The 119th Infantry's 1st Battalion alone had lost 354 men in 5 days of fighting through the Rimberg Woods and Merkstein-Hofstadt, while the 18th Infantry had given up Captain Cambron, 5 more dead, and over 30 wounded on Crucifix Hill. Yet the German collapse was unmistakable. Over 400 prisoners captured at Merkstein, 245 more bagged by Colonel Herlong's battalion, and hundreds of others swept up across the front, as entire pillbox garrisons surrendered without a fight. The 19th Corps had breached the West Wall, secured the bridgehead and isolated Aachen, the first major German city to be threatened with capture. In the White House ceremony after the war, President Harry Truman looked at Captain Bobbie Brown and said he would have given anything to trade places with him. Brown stood at attention, the Medal of Honor around his neck, and the scar from the German grenade that had torn a piece from his cheek was still visible, a map of Crucifix Hill written on his face. Lieutenant Colonel John H. Leonard, who had commanded the 1st Battalion through every hour of the operation, returned to quiet peacetime soldiering. The records say little of his later years, but the men who served under him never forgot the sight of him leading his command group through the shell-torn streets of Verlottenheide, carbine in hand, clearing houses himself so his young soldiers would follow. The legacy of the Aachen encirclement rests not on strategy maps or corps boundaries, but on the fact that ordinary men, miners, sons and factory hands, draftees and volunteers, crossed a muddy river without their tanks, reduced pillboxes with satchel charges and flamethrowers, held their ground against crack counterattacks, and then walked silently through the darkness past German sentries to seal the fate of a city. The stone cross on Crucifix Hill had been shattered and toppled, but the men who had climbed that bare slope under machine gun fire had given the American First Army the key terrain it needed. Aachen would receive its ultimatum within hours, and the next great battles for the road to the Rhine would be fought on ground they had already bled to take. The Aachen encirclement closed, and the first great German city fell under an American stranglehold. The men who stormed Crucifix Hill and walked silently through the dark to the Ravensburg had redefined what infantry could achieve against concrete and steel. The road to the Rhine remained long, but the autumn of 1944 had proven that even the Siegfried line could be broken by the courage of ordinary soldiers carrying their explosives on their backs.